Kaboom! It's my 12th birthday, and I spend it with my eyes glued to my TV screen. The mad bomber zipping back and forth, dropping bombs. And me trying to save the world with just these little buckets of water. Yep. When I was a kid, I was addicted to the Atari 2600. And my favorite game by far was Kaboom. Because Kaboom is white knuckle, engaging, edge of your seat, exciting. Where did the time go? Fun. Let's do it again. And the challenge today is that most presenters, whether intentional or not, encourage their audience to sit back and watch instead of stand up and participate. And the exciting truth is that when your audience participates, it's engaging, exciting, and fun. They'll come back for more products, more services. They'll bring you more referrals. But the instant that you turn on PowerPoint or ask the audience to hold their questions until the end, you've lost them. And it's very, very difficult to get them back. I'll always remember my first interactive presentation. I was terrified. It's 1995, and as a technical team lead of a software company, Boston Technology, it's my task to present our design for a voicemail system. In engineering terms, I'm going to be talking about the call flow, and it looks like this. Trust me, presentations don't get much drier. I had given dozens of these talks in my career with a reasonable amount of success, but nothing could have prepared me for the incredible results I would get when, this time, I just couldn't bring myself to use PowerPoint. I couldn't stomach it. So, summoning up all my community theater experience and courage, I proposed an outlandish idea to the rest of the engineering team. Hey, let's act it out. It was a huge success. One engineer played the phone call and interacted with the team leads for each component, gathering information, making decisions, playing prompts, demonstrating the call flow. The engineers loved it, and more importantly, the executive office loved it. In fact, they actually pushed out an engineering deadline, so we could present it 3 more times that week to our board of directors and investors. It was fun and easier to understand than a block diagram. And it's that element of acting it out, that encourages your audience to participate with your material. In fact, the same way I inspired those engineers to interact with each other by mimicking the interaction of the software, I inspire people in my workshops to interact with each other the same way they do when business networking. People have a good time, they learn a few new skills, and I drive a lot of signups to my Elevator Pitch Tips email newsletter and my Network Like a Pro home study course. And then, all of a sudden, I faced my biggest challenge as a professional speaker. My wife and I had a baby. And then we had another one. Suddenly, scheduling in-person presentations became, and still is, a logistics nightmare. So I started doing webinars and struggled for several years to recreate that in-person interactive environment in an online setting. Yep, I tried all the features: polls, hand-raising, surveys. I attended hundreds of in-person and online presentations gathering best practices. And now I expect to get even better results from my webinars than I do in person. What kind of results? Sign-ups for my newsletter, inquiries about coaching, and purchasing of programs that I offer online. So today I'm going to be sharing 3 key unconventional techniques I've discovered that make it possible to run in-person workshops online. Let's take some inspiration from our friend, the Mad Bomber. What makes him so exciting? First of all, he's relentless. He's got a limitless supply of bombs. He can drop them at any time, anywhere. You could be blown up at any minute. In webinars, of course, excitement comes not so much from the fear of getting blown up. Excitement comes from delicious anticipation. You're not sure when you might hear the technique that inspires you to take that next leap to make you even more effective in your work. So the Mad Bomber keeps you on your toes, and you want to keep your online programs moving. You keep people on their toes and a little bit off balance. So if you start with an agenda, you give people license to snooze. So we'll talk about a better way to start the webinar in a minute. But first, just like in Kaboom, the simplest tool is the best. So how do you fight a Mad Bomber? It turns out they decided you fight a Mad Bomber with buckets of water. It's simply brilliant. And the best interactivity tool in the webinar world is equally simple, and brilliant. It's the chat box. Interactivity is all about conversation, and the chat box gives you a way to connect in real time with all your participants. As a bonus, it also keeps a record of all the questions and comments. That information is pure marketing gold, and it's not available when you're speaking to people in person. So today we're discussing 3 unconventional techniques you can use to run interactive workshops online. And the first tip we're going to talk about is a tip that I call invite them in. So at first blush, the Mad Bomber may not seem so inviting. After all, he's dropping bombs. But he will wait for you to get ready, and he does play fair. And he does want you to engage him in the challenge. So the question is, what does this look like in the webinar world? Well, the moment that weaned me off of PowerPoint showed me just how addictive that slide deck can be. I had signed up to do a no-fee presentation for a local networking group. Then 1 week before the presentation, the host called me. Their projector was not available. And they suggested that I rent one, except that I was not about to rent a projector for a no-fee presentation. So I didn't. I did the presentation with no slides. And I was very, very nervous. And what happened was it was so much better. I got more sign-ups for my email newsletter than ever before. I now actually sell a webinar that I did, a joint webinar that I did with someone who was on one of those calls. And it turns out that I've removed a whole layer of stress from myself and from the event organizers. Because one of the big stresses I was carrying into events was, is the technology going to work? And so when you remove that layer, you see how people relax. You see how organizers relax when you tell them that you don't need any technology. And you don't. I'll admit it is a little scary at first. Breaking with convention is scary. And it's necessary if you want better results. So not using PowerPoint puts more on me as the presenter. And I don't ever use PowerPoint when I am presenting in person anymore. So it puts me on the spot. It makes me step up my game, and I get better results. Now, in webinars, you do need something for people to look at. And so what we're going to talk about now is a particular way of using PowerPoint. And I like to think of webinars as a dinner party. I like to think of interactive things as a dinner party. And if you think about a dinner party, have you ever welcomed people to your home? So how many times have you ever welcomed people to your home, made them sit quietly in a corner, and wait until everyone arrived? No. You talk to them. You joke. You tell stories. The reason that people don't usually interact on a webinar is that the webinar presenter has implicitly or explicitly told them that it's not okay. Stay on the line. We'll get started in a minute. Please hold all your questions until the end. These are all interaction killers. Instead, start your webinar with conversation starters. I've got an example of one that I use at the beginning of this webinar up on the screen. You can engage people in the chat box before you begin. And it gives people permission to start interacting with you right from the beginning. And when you give them that permission, they'll continue interacting with you all throughout the program, just like you're all doing now. So a question I get a lot is it harder to take questions as you go? People tend to find it easier to take questions at the end. And I got to say, I find it easier to take questions as I go. It wasn't necessarily true when I started. It was a little challenging. But like with any skill, it gets easier with time and practice. And I think it really creates a different kind of online experience when you're working with people that way, and when you allow people in. I actually saw 2 presentations, 2 presenters that I liked very, very much, and they had completely opposite approaches. One treated the stage as kind of his place, and he was not available when he was off stage, and it gave that kind of feel to the room. The other guy was always available, equally good presenter, always available to people. He was doing signings and talking to people and chatting during the breaks. And so you get to decide what kind of presentations you want to do. I think that online, the more you go towards interacting and that sort of thing is really, really helpful. Really, really helpful. So the first technique is to welcome people into the program, kind of invite them in. And what I'd like to ask you to do now is, if you haven't downloaded the worksheet already, now is a good time to go ahead and download it. And if you can't for some reason, just pull out a piece of paper. And the first question on the worksheet is, I'd like you to think of questions that you could ask when you think about a program you're doing or what you're going to be working on online. What are the kinds of questions that you're going to be asking people? What are the kinds of questions that you can help people engage with? And if you're so inspired to type as you think about them, you want to type them into the chat box, that's great. It'd be great to share them with people. We can take a look at them and see how it is. So once again, I'm going to go quiet for a minute, give you about a minute to think about, fill in the worksheet. What questions can you ask that would kind of engage people in the work that you're doing? Go ahead and think about that and write them down and put them into the chat box. Yes, Laura, the question I'm having you think about is the first question on the worksheet. You have to think about what questions you could ask your prospects, the people that you're going to, as you think about putting your stuff online, what are the questions that you could ask them to get them started in a conversation? So Ray, that's a good start. I like where you're headed with that. What if you put your thoughts into words quickly? I'd encourage you to even take it one step further and talk about a time that you were stuck, or have you ever been in a situation where words didn't come quickly? So kind of get into the head of people where they're coming from for that sort of thing. But I think that's a great way of looking at it. Yeah, Suzanne, I think that's a great question. Great question. What has prompted you to do that? Yeah, Colleen, I love that. What's your favorite fundraising technique? Yeah, you guys are doing great. Great. These are great questions. Great. These are great questions to ask. And see, that's the thing. What you're looking to do is to engage people in the material even before it started. Get people thinking about what it is that you're going to be talking about, and make it okay to interact with you. That's really what we're looking at. I'll give you a minute to finish working on this, and then we'll move on. Right, yes, you're heading in the right direction. What's it like when you have to, you don't know that people are scared about being shot down, or maybe you do. If it's true that people are scared about being shot down, then you can certainly use that. But I like, what is it like for you when you have to speak to senior executives, or what's your biggest fear about having to speak to senior executives? That's a great kind of thing to do. Andrew, how can you help your coworkers with customer interaction? Yeah, you could even make that one a little stronger, Andrea, with what's the best way you found to help your coworkers with customer interaction, that sort of thing. Kim, yeah, like what accomplishment you're proud of, that's great. Andrew, I wanted to just put it into, think about kind of what's the best way you found. That's kind of the phrasing I wanted to use. So not how can you help, but what's the best way you found. It makes it a little more personal for people, makes it a little easier to answer the question. Yeah, Ray, how about when was the most embarrassing time you were ever tongue-tied? That's the kind of thing you're looking for. What's the most embarrassing time you ever got tongue-tied? That you're doing exactly the right kind of thinking here. Good work. Okay, great. So keep thinking about that. And the good thing about this worksheet, it's something you can keep with you as you work on your online work. It's a good thing to keep with you to remember these kinds of techniques. So let's launch right into the second technique. And the second technique is tell stories. So one of the first webinars I ever did my host made a terrible rookie mistake. He asked if anyone had questions and opened up the phone lines. What followed was the second most uncomfortable 40 seconds I have ever had to endure in any kind of on-stage experience. Silence. Dead silence. Despite repeated requests for people to give us something to talk about. And it made me look foolish, right? It made me look foolish, and it was extremely uncomfortable for everyone. It was extremely uncomfortable for people on the call. It was just extremely uncomfortable. And so I vowed never, ever again to make that mistake. And to this day, I never recommend opening up the phone lines on a webinar, because when you're in a group, it's one thing to get that kind of verbal feedback, like when you're all in the room together and looking at each other. But people aren't really used to participating as a group over the phone. And so it tends to be easier and more productive online to run things through chat. I mean, obviously in person you would never have people write things and pass them up to you. And the same way online, you can't really run a big webinar by having everyone talking at the same time. So it's easier and much more productive to run interactions through chat. And so if we go back to our Mad Bomber friend for a minute, he has a plan. He's going to drop bombs until you don't have any buckets left. He's going to keep dropping the bombs. And everyone goes into a presentation with a plan. What I'm going to suggest right now is that the plan that most people take into their presentation, they could take it a step further. And by taking it that step further is going to make it much more interactive, much more compelling, and much more interesting for people. So this next critical step that you would take to make it interactive is telling stories. So in a 45-minute webinar, you have time for an intro, about 3 points, and a conclusion. And pretty much everyone goes into the webinar with that. The thing that's missing from 90% of the presentations is stories. And today I'm going to ask you to kind of take that next step. So after you come up with your outline, instead of just sharing the helpful tip, such as, for example, you never ever want to open up the phone lines during a webinar, I encourage you to tell a story that demonstrates your point instead, about a time that you did it, or one of the people that you work with did it, or you witnessed it done, any sort of story. So I want you, what you're going to start thinking about is telling a story. Part of the preparation for doing online presentations, I think it's true for presentations in general, but certainly for online presentations, part of the preparation is you get to the point that you've got your outline, and then you start working on which stories are going to highlight that for you. And if you're sitting out there thinking, oh, I'm not a storyteller, I can't do that. You know, that's not a good approach. I'll give you a quick little test. So I want you to think about the last vacation you took. And if you were describing that vacation, would you describe it now? Let's see. We stayed in a hotel, went on a few rides to the amusement park, and had lunch. Later on, we had dinner and we saw a show. No. I don't think any of you would tell me that about your vacation. But that's what most webinars sound like. And honestly, that could be anybody's vacation, right? Who hasn't been on that vacation that you describe? And so when you're talking about being interactive, when you're talking about interactive webinars, the key is that you want to make it more personal. For example, Johnny and Katie were so excited about our recent trip to Disney World that Katie forgot to pack any underwear, and Johnny got so scared on Thunder Mountain that he hugged a stranger. And Betsy, well, she was laughing so hard at this variety show that she ruined a pair of contact lenses. We're talking about using details, personal details, business details, any kind of stories with details, really, as long as it relates to the point that you're making. One of my real pet peeves in presentations is when people stand up on stage and start talking about how they came to the presentation today, that on the way over they were thinking about what they were going to say. And unless you're giving a presentation about coming up with presentation techniques, I really don't recommend that kind of story. What I recommend is coming up with a kind of story that really illustrates your point. And so once again, the technique we're talking about here when we talk about telling the story, we're talking about doing your outline the way you normally do, and then taking the time to come up with a story that illustrates each point. And so on your worksheet now, there's a little bit of work to do now, because I want you to think about the kind of work that you're going to be doing. And as I said, when you're doing a webinar, you really come up with 3 points. There are a bunch of folks on the call who've been through this kind of presentation skills training with me, that you come up with your 3 points, and then you give your 3 points, and it's a very kind of clean way of doing it. So what I'd like you to think about right now is at least one of those points. So when you think about what the kind of webinar you're going to be doing, the kind of presentations that you're going to be giving online, what is one of the points that you're going to be making? And then I want you to start thinking about a story that you have that you could tell to highlight that example. And again, the example we're doing right now is that the technique I'm talking about is tell stories. And the story I told is a story about not opening up the phone lines on the webinar. So again, what I'd like you to do is just take a minute to think about this. Fill out your worksheet. Now, if you haven't downloaded the worksheet, you can just do this on a piece of paper. But think about when you think about kind of the information you want to get across to the people that you're working with. What is this point you're trying to make? And what's a story that's related to that point? And again, if you're inspired to type it into the chat box, we can kind of share what people are thinking about and kind of do some group coaching that way as well. So go ahead and think about that. Carolyn, excellent. That's exactly the kind of thing. That's a great point to be making in this kind of webinar. And so now the challenge is to come up with a story. The question is, do you have kind of a story in mind of somebody, of either something you did or somebody you know of that a story about how that actually happens, right? Because it's one thing to just say that to someone, and what I'm saying is it's another step forward to tell a story that highlights that point. So that's good. That's a great point to make in a webinar. It's an excellent point. Great, yeah, Colleen, that's wonderful. That's a good. I got a couple of stories like that myself of sales. Like, yeah, just just keep at it. And so, Ray, I'd like you to think a little bit about what you're meaning by persuasive, right? What was the result someone got? What's the result someone's going to get from this kind of impact, from making this kind of impact? And again, a story that kind of represents, either a customer story that you've got or kind of a story that you worked on for that. That's good. Yep, Andrea, that's great. That's good. That's exactly the kind of story, right? That's the kind of thing. And actually, a step you can take that even further when you're working with text, especially, have the tech tell the story. Right? It's the kind of thing. It's much more powerful if you have the tech tell the story about how they wowed the customer than if you tell their story of it. So that's another technique you can use in a webinar. That if you've got people who have these sorts of things to add, if you have a good example that comes from somebody who's on your team, let them offer it. It's the same thing I talked about when I talked about the engineers, the engineers doing the program. We all shared our part. I didn't do any talking. I let the engineers do all the talking. And the same, you can do the same kind of thing in your stuff. Let the text do the talking. Ray, that's a great point. Thank you. That's a good one. That is a good one. Ray, yes, yeah, you're on the right track. That's good. That's good, although maybe define more what the sick child means, because, again, if the child just has a cold, you may not care, but there's some other stuff that you might be willing to pay even more for. So, yes, that's good. Yeah, well, you do. That's a good point, Ray. You do have to walk that line, right? Whenever you're doing this kind of work, you are looking for stories that don't cross that line. And depending on the kind of industry you're in, the kind of people that you're talking to, that line shifts, right? So you want to, there's kind of a different, the evening news is kind of one extreme of, our playground's dangerous for your children. Tune in at 10, right? Versus giving something that's a little bit more a little bit less fantastic, right? I mean, and you can still have as much compelling example without kind of, the dying. Dying is a little bit morbid, so that's what I'm saying. Like that might not work because it's too morbid. But again, you're thinking about the right sorts of things. That's the kind of work that you want to be thinking about when you're doing these presentations. Yes, and Ray, thank you. That details. This is all about the details. When you're talking about webinars and presentations, it is all in the details. It's all about giving the details. And that's the thing. I mean, when most people put up a PowerPoint presentation and read off their list of bullets, if you asked anyone in the room to give that presentation, they'd come up with pretty much those bullets, right? I mean, it's not, if you're teaching someone how to interview, for example, people pretty much know you have to dress correctly and you have to look to people in the eye. I mean, there's a set of things that everyone knows you need to be taught. And the way you really set yourself apart as a presenter, the way that you really kind of differentiate yourself is by using experience, right? By using the ways that you are different from anyone else. You're different from anyone else who's ever taught whatever it is that you're teaching. And your stories are the reason that you're different. And so using those stories to illustrate the points is really why it makes that so much more powerful. And again, I recommend all these things if you're doing in-person presentations. And I think they're even more important online because online you can't see each other. So online the stories have even more and more impact. Great. Okay. So I'll encourage you all to keep working on that. This is a really important part of an important part of the work that you're doing. As you talk about webinars, stories are the way humans communicate with each other. Right. Before we could write anything down, we told stories around the campfires. That's how this all started. So we're all really attuned to listening to stories and to learning from stories. And so again, when you take this extra step we're talking about, set up your outline just like you always do because your outline's fine. And then once you have your outline, you want to turn it into stories. You want to find stories for that. So we've done 2 of the 3 tips we're going to be talking about today. The first tip was to invite people in to kind of start the interaction before the interaction starts. The second is to tell stories because, as I say, if you want to engage people, you either got to ask a question or tell a story. Those are the only two ways to do it. So that's kind of what we've talked about so far. And so the third thing I'm going to talk about, I call this tip "Take a Break." And as many of you know, I publish an email newsletter, Elevator Pitch Tips. And I've been doing that for a couple of years now, but when I first started doing it, the real challenge with that sort of medium, the real challenge with hitting send on an email newsletter that goes out to however many people it goes out to, is that you're really sending it off into a vacuum. You have you don't get much feedback. You don't get any real-time feedback about what's going on. And for the first several months, I just sent the newsletter out kind of on faith. And it wasn't until a couple of months into it that I started running into people who said, "Oh yeah, I read your newsletter every time." And so the work is happening, right? The tendency is to feel that you kind of have to shout or go overboard. Like when you're not getting any feedback, the temptation is to ramp it up a little bit. And so what we're talking about here is webinars are exactly the same. There's no feedback mechanism. There's no feedback mechanism for laughter. There's no feedback mechanism for if you're going too fast or too slow. Right? When you're face to face with a bunch of people, you get a lot of clues that you don't really get in a webinar. So the tendency, when faced with no feedback, is to speed up and do more, and you just kind of keep pounding on it. And what I'm going to suggest in this situation is that the Mad Bomber, even though he's committed to world destruction, still takes a break after each level, right? He throws a bunch of bombs at you, and then he stops. Then he throws a bunch more bombs at you, and then he stops. And so it's this break that I think is really important for people when you're in a webinar kind of situation. So in person, when you're doing interactivity to me in person means that participants are interacting with each other. When you're doing interactive in-person presentations, what you're really looking to do is get the group interacting with each other. When you're online, it's really, well, and so I'll say also when you're in person, they're interacting with your material by interacting with each other. So that's kind of that's the focus there, that when you're all together, they interact with the material with each other. When you're online, it's more difficult to interact with each other. I saw some back and forth in the chat box. People know each other on the call, and they were talking back and forth. But it's a little bit more difficult to get people to interact with each other when you're online. And so what you're really looking for them to do is interact with you as the presenter through the chat box. So they're interacting with you and your material. And so the way I like to do this, as you've been experiencing on this call, is through worksheets. So the technique is that after you've made each point, you give everyone a minute to jot down their ideas, and again, inspire them to share their information through the chat box. It's a really great way of getting people engaged. And I will say that the first time I didn't use PowerPoint at a presentation, it was so interesting to watch that I didn't give people the chance to sit back and relax. Right? It was the kind of thing when you turn on your slides, people know what that means. You're going to darken the room. I'm going to sit back. I'm going to just be listening. I'm just going to be listening to what you're saying. And it's the kind of thing once you've given that vibe, it's very hard to get people to come back out of that. Right? Once people have kind of assumed that your presentation is going to be about them listening to you talk, then they just sit back and listen to you talk. And if you're and the reason that most presentations, the reason most online webinars don't get a lot of interaction is that they've set up that barrier from the beginning, right? Most webinars start off, please sit there quietly until we're ready. We'll be with you in just a moment, and please hold all your questions until the end. And those are the kinds of things that really get in the way of opening up this kind of dialogue. So the other thing I'll remind you of is that for a lot of the work that you're doing, you know your material so well that it kind of becomes obvious. And you want to remember that the people that you're working with, it's not so obvious. Now, I actually got feedback out of an early webinar I did from someone. I always talk too fast, and I'm sure that I'm talking a little bit too fast right now, which is much slower than I would want to be talking. But I got feedback from the first webinar I did where I had given people some time to chat, but about 3 seconds. And, okay, so think up some ideas and write it down. Okay, good, let's keep moving on. And it is kind of a symptom of doing webinars that without much feedback, you tend to not like the silence. And what I'm suggesting is that what you can do is, and the worksheet is a good way of kind of letting people work with the material. The people are still engaged even though they're not listening to you talk. So it's good to leave a little bit of space and a little bit of quiet that lets people interact with your material and think about it. The other secret about presentations, people who present, is that everyone's engaged and excited when you're on the call, but then you get off the call and get back to life and you forget everything you've learned. And so as a presenter, what I like giving worksheets because that helps people kind of retain what it is that we talked about. It's a cheat sheet they can use. It's a cheat sheet they can use later on. Right? I mean, I do a business networking workshop that I give people a worksheet that it answers the only 3 questions you'll ever be asked at a networking event are answered on that piece of paper. Right? So when you leave that piece of paper and people joke with me, can I bring this to my next event? I'm like, yes, please do. Please bring that piece of paper to the next event. If nothing else, it is a conversation starter. Hey, what's on that piece of paper? Hey, it's my elevator pitch, right? So, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So what we're talking about is giving people a chance to catch up, right? You're presenting your information, and again, the reason that I really cut it down to 3 points is that there's only so much that people can absorb. There's only so much people can absorb, and if you make it 3 clear points, that helps people kind of key into it. And I'll say that it's not dead time. The time you just went through the time and you didn't feel like it was dead time because you were actually working. We were interacting online and all that kind of thing. So I really like this step. And so again, in the previous section, we talked about taking the next step of developing stories. And the second next step that I'm talking about here, so this is kind of, people prepare a certain way, and I'm suggesting 2 additional steps. The first is to develop those stories, and the second is to develop that worksheet, which means that people can take something tangible from an online event. And so, keeping with my point, I'm now going to give you a minute or two. There isn't something for this on the worksheet, but feel free to turn it over or just scribble in the margins. Any ideas you have for what your worksheet's going to look like? What is it that you want people to take away from the talk? And it's kind of an end cap, right? We talked about the questions that you asked at the beginning, and this is kind of an end cap to the presentation. What is it that you want people taking away from it? So again, if you have some ideas that you'd like to share with the group, that would be great. But let's spend a minute thinking about what your worksheet's going to look like. What are you kind of going to give people to work on when you're doing this online work? Laura, yeah, that's a good question. Would offering a copy of the presentation slideshow also be a takeaway? Well, see, the cool thing about online is that you can give them a full recording of the thing that happened online. So I don't usually have people ask for the slides. I mean, you can certainly share the slides, and that's fine. But if you'll notice, my slides, the process I use is actually from my presentations coach, who's Andy Sachs, who's also on the call. Hi, Andy. That I use mainly pictures. There's very little text, so getting my slide deck doesn't really help them necessarily. So I'm happy to share my slide deck, but I'm not sure it helps. What I really like to do is give them the worksheet because that's the thing that they're really learning. Andrea, yes, pre-webinar questionnaire is great. I sometimes do that as well in my presentations. Send out a thing, please send in your questions beforehand, and it's a great technique. Great technique. So Ray, usually speaking in the comments. Well, Ray, based on what you said, I'm very interested to hear more about what it is that you do. I think that worksheet. I think that's a great worksheet thing. If you have kind of phrasings that people can use or ways, you'll see that I do some of that in my work, kind of helping people phrase things or put things in templates. And so if you can have a worksheet that you can give people that helps them think on their feet, that's great. I think that'd be really, really great. Yeah, Andrew, those are good questions. I'd like you to, again, I don't like, they're a little bit wide, and what I mean by that is that what's the thing that you most like about working at Desco? That would be the question that I would ask people. Asking people kind of what should we start doing is it's a little bit, it's hard to answer that question, and so what I'm suggesting is phrasing them in a way that's a little bit easier to answer. So, what's the thing you like best about working at Desco? What's the most frustrating thing about working at Desco? I think that'll get more at the answers that you're looking for. So yes, I like that idea of sending out pre-game questions. Ray, it's another great idea. Organize executive briefing, sure. Great. Want those answers? Yeah, exactly. Well, Ray, I think that what defines your toughest audiences, I think that's actually a good question for I think that's a good pre-webinar question. A good thing on the worksheet would be techniques you have to work on how to handle toughest audiences, right? That would be that would be how I'd look at that. That you've got a kind of good pre-webinar question. What defines your what's the toughest audience you've ever been in front of and why? And then when they're done with the webinar, they're going to have a cheat sheet on kind of how to handle the the two major types of tough audiences, something like that. I think that would be a good way of doing those things. We've got time for a couple more questions. We got a couple more comments. We got them. Yeah, Andrew. I mean, the worksheet. Well, what you want for them to have on the worksheet is the things they're going to start doing on a regular basis that are going to blow their customers' minds. So I could see the webinar getting them thinking about little things they could add to their day that would make a big impact on the customer. Calling ahead or communicating something or whatever it is. But the worksheet would give them kind of a cheat sheet when they're out at the customer. What are they supposed to be doing? It could almost be a checklist for what they should be doing at the customer to make sure they're meeting the standards. Um, yeah, Suzanne, that's we'll talk in a minute about how to figure out your worksheet. That's good. Yeah, Ray, you're exactly on the right track. The information that's persuasive to executives, that'd be a very valuable handout. Very valuable handout. Yeah, great, great. Cool. Okay, so as you keep working with this material, go ahead and keep typing things in. I'm going to do a quick thing and then tell a story, and then it's really up to you guys. I'm getting toward the end of what I had planned for today. I like to end after about 45 minutes, but I am willing to stay on the phone if people have questions or want to keep talking about this. So we'll go through a couple of things, and then I'll open up the chat box to any other questions that have come up or anything like that. So to Suzanne's question, how to figure this out. So there are kind of three programs that I offer people, and any of you on the call, if you want to spend 10 minutes with me, if you're intrigued by what you hear or not sure how to get moving, just shoot me an email or call my hotline, and I'll set up a 10-minute call. I'll be happy to talk to you about what you're trying to do. Like that's just say that. So I offer a program called the 3-pointer, which is kind of a what's your point. It helps you get to those 3 points and help decide which story it's going to be that you're going to be working on, and that can also tail into this worksheet stuff, right? It all kind of ties together, right? In good presentations, the whole thing ties together. That you have kind of the pre-questions, get people thinking about the right sorts of things. The talk keeps them thinking about that, and then their worksheet gives them techniques they can use to make that happen. So it's an individualized coaching thing, how to grab their attention, how to kind of start the presentation, the 3 points you want to make, the stories you're going to be telling about that, and leave them wanting more is this worksheet, kind of giving them some techniques and understanding that more techniques are available. So there's this 3-pointer idea. I also saw a question go on earlier, like we're not sure how to get online, and I do offer a hosting package. So if you've never hosted a webinar, I don't really recommend going out and trying it by yourself. That's kind of how I did it. I just went out and tried it by myself, and I don't really recommend that approach. So I do offer a hosting package where you get to be on my platform. I work with you, kind of to co-host the session with you. We do practice sessions, and I teach you how to do the hosting, and you get recordings out of it. So that's another thing that's available if you're just not sure where to get started. Again, give me a call and we can talk for a couple of minutes, and if it sounds like the right kind of thing, then we can talk about what that looks like. But I love it. I just switched hosting platforms, actually. I love this new hosting platform I'm on, and it's not nearly as complicated as people think it is, but it is helpful to go through it with someone kind of the first time. And so the third thing I offer is what I call the extreme makeover. So if you have a presentation that you're doing already, either in person or online, and you really want to bump it up, this is the kind of thing you can invigorate your webinars. You can put your workshops online. It can include the hosting package if you want, but really a soup to nuts kind of designing the online experience for the folks that you're working with. So that's my quick commercial. So today what we've been working on are 3 techniques you can use to get the kind of standing ovation in the webinar environment. That's really what we're talking about. And again, the ways we talked about, the techniques that we talked about were invite people in, and then tell stories, and then you want to use a worksheet. You want to use a worksheet, kind of get them involved with the work. And so thank you very much, everyone. That's what I had. That's what I had planned to talk about today. If you have questions, I'll certainly stay on the line as long as people want to keep talking about this stuff, because I'll talk about it forever. So if you have questions, go ahead and type them in. Well, thank you to all of you. It's been great working with you. I appreciate you being so interactive on this webinar. That's great. Yeah, if you've got questions, go ahead and throw them in. Suzanne, yeah, so figuring out what to put on the worksheet, again, it's a way of, you probably are trying to cover too much stuff, and it is a discipline of doing presentations that you really want to cut yourself down to those 3 things. And so once you've cut that down, it'll be a little bit clearer what you want to put on the worksheet. So there is a discipline in that to making that happen. So that's I think that's the answer to your question. Putting what you put on the worksheet, you kind of want to think about what do you want people to take away from this? Kind of what are the skills that they need to do whatever it is you're teaching them to do, and then you put that sort of thing on the worksheet. Kim, great question, thank you. So how do you keep people on their toes? Well, there are a couple of techniques I use. I will actually suggest anyone the recording. This recording will be available. You'll get it probably. It's usually available within 24 hours. You'll get an email with the recording, and I'd encourage you to go back through it. Every single technique we talked about today, I used in this webinar, so it's kind of an experience kind of thing. So, Kim, the question that you mentioned earlier. So keeping people on their toes with anticipation. If you'll notice, I started the webinar with a story, the Kaboom story, which is how I kind of came up with this whole webinar thing. And I only gave you hints as to what the agenda was. I never really set out the agenda. I just kept rolling stories together to keep things going. And the breaks that we take, the chance for you to kind of interact with the material and interact with me are another key part of that. It's a key part of keeping people on their toes, that they know I'm going to be asking them to do things. I'm going to be asking you to do things, so you're kind of paying attention and thinking about it and keeping up with it. So that's kind of that's a rough cut of how the anticipation goes. But again, the key is the storytelling and there's a very clear agenda, and I'm sure by now you understand the agenda, but I didn't share it with you up front. And again, knowing that you're going to be working on this stuff, having a worksheet creates that kind of anticipation too. Those are excellent customers. So Andrea, your question, can work with those who use some boosting. Yeah, well, I think, Andrea, I think the thing you're talking about in the question, in terms of having functional teams helping each other, I think you can do that in a general webinar, right? I mean, it can be tough to kind of say to people, you need remedial help, so get on this webinar, versus we're all going to get on this webinar to learn how to do better customer service. And I think that you're right that you want to identify those functional teams who are better at this stuff, and they can be the ones that tell the stories and give the tips. Right? It's the kind of thing you can have them, right? What you want to do is help them write this up. So what are the stories? They'll come up with their tips and say, okay, tell me a story about a time this happened. And trust me, they'll have plenty of stories. And then sharing those stories with the field, I think, is a worthwhile thing. How many slides do people use in a 45-minute presentation? This presentation had 44 slides in it. But you'll notice that I skipped through slides there's some slides I skipped through pretty quickly. I mean, if you're going to put text on your slide, I recommend probably 4 or 5 slides for a 45-minute presentation. But if you're using graphics, you can use more because people can absorb more of it as you go. So that's a great question. So again, this presentation used about 44 slides, which is about typical for what I run. But again, I use a different approach to this. Thank you, Andy Sachs. Than I've seen most people do. I see them work ahead of me. Laura, yeah, I mean, all things are possible. I still do the in-person workshops. I mean, it's not that I only work online now. I mean, I really, and I honestly, I mean, I love doing in-person stuff. I absolutely love it. I love being there with people and seeing this stuff happen. I also love online webinars because I can get people who are, we all didn't have to get together in a location this afternoon, right? We can just get together and share some stuff and interact with each other. And so Laura, as you're working on it, it's another avenue. It's another stream for you. Like, it's another way of getting your message out. And the cool thing too is, as I said, you're all going to get a recording of this. So when you put your work into webinars, you can easily get recordings of them, and you can repackage those. I sell a lot of my webinars kind of post-webinar thing. So that it is a way. I'm not asking you to give up your in-person work. I want you to keep your in-person work. But I'm suggesting that there's another way that you could kind of generate some income streams by using webinars. That's where this is coming from. Andrea, thanks. Kim, thank you. Hey, Andrea, we've worked on that a lot. Is let them be the speakers. Yep. Yeah, Laura, of course. I mean, again, this is another. It's an additional option. I'm not. Again, I have not given up my in-person stuff. And when my girls are older, I'll go back to doing more in-person things. It's just hard logistically now to make that happen. But I'm looking forward to doing more of that. Oh, you know what, folks? I forgot. There's actually a survey. So we're doing questions. There's a survey link on this page. You should be able to just click on that link. So if you wouldn't mind, I do like getting feedback on these things. If you wouldn't mind filling out the survey, it might just take 2 minutes or so. I would appreciate that. I'll give you probably one off to the survey right now, but I'll give you a minute more. If you still have questions, go ahead and type those in. We'll keep going the questions, and then if anybody's got more questions, I will be happy to handle those. All right, great. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it. If you have any questions about any of the things we did today, feel free to contact me. My phone number and email are all over the presentation. And again, you will expect to see the link to the presentation recording coming by within 24 hours or so. Thanks a lot, everyone. I will talk to you later. Bye.